Okay, cool. Also, if you want closed captions, there should be a button on the bottom panel of Zoom that says CC, and then you'll be able to see a live transcript. Hopefully that should work for everyone. Cool. Okay, so I'm Sab. I use they, them pronouns. So I've got brown hair with an asymmetrical haircut. I'm white. I've got a purple jumper on. And a bedroom background behind me. Okay, so yeah, this event is part of the Thinking in Action series by the Centre for Engaged Philosophy of the University of Sheffield. So thank you for enabling this to happen. There's also some other great events planned as part of the series. Yeah, so I'll just give a brief introduction and then we can start with the presentations. Yeah, so this is a discussion about capitalism and mental health. Yeah, so just brief, yeah, so capitalism, I'm sure we all are like very much familiar with, but yeah, I guess more specifically, we're talking about neoliberalism, the structure that we all live in, which is based around maximizing profit, and economic growth is seen as the means to flourishing, and this kind of rule basically controls everything, like government policy, many things, and by mental health, yeah, I guess a more all-encompassing way of describing it is like, yeah, talking about distress, emotions, how we feel and how that affects our lives, behaviors, actions, and ability to live. So yeah, we're basically just talking about the links between these things. So I think, yeah, the links are really clear and obvious and are part of like day-to-day life and conversation a lot. But I think something that's not talked about as much is how the ways that society actually frames mental health and like the kind of dominant resources that exist to talk about these things and relate to them is actually tied up with the very structure of capitalism. And yeah, this is like through psychiatry, which is the sort of dominant narrative and institution for dealing with mental health. So this, yeah, plays an active role in how we feel by actually shaping like how we feel about how we feel. So that's kind of like the basis for framing this discussion. Yeah, and I'm excited to see what happens when we unpack some of these and consider alternatives and like different ways of framing and responding to distress. And yeah, I'm just excited to discuss these things and with some really great speakers that are coming from different angles. Yeah, and I just wanted to say one more thing, that yeah, when we start to consider like these kind of collective connections, then mental health does become part of like a justice framework. So like mental health, distress, trauma, all of these things are tied up with social justice. They are political. They're just so often not framed in this way and pushed aside as like individualized problems. Yeah. Okay, so without further ado, we'll start the presentation. So we've got 3 presentations from 3 speakers, and then we'll aim to have a break at around 8 p.m. It might be slightly later, like 10 to 15 minutes break, and then we'll reconvene for the panel. So if you'll like save your questions for the panel, that would be great. Oh yeah, and if I think everyone's muted, aren't they? Okay. Okay, so our first speaker is from Recovery in the Bin. So this is a user-led critical theorist and activist collective who critique the notion of recovery and how it is played out, demanding a robust social model of madness, distress, and confusion, placing mental health within the context of social justice and wider class struggle. So recovery in the bit. So I think, how should we do it? Yeah, if you
pinned the okay, let me just, so I think then you just should be visible to everybody. You can still change the layout and the view if you want.
Is that
okay, Sabina?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, so recovering a bit. So if you've got like a digital presentation, you can just share your screen, or if you're just talking, then yeah, just feel free to speak.
Okay, thanks, Sab. I'll just get started. I do have a couple of slides I'd like to share towards the end, so it'd be good if I could have permission to share screen, because I don't have that at the moment. But you know, it's about 10 minutes in at least. So yeah, thank you everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of Recovery in the Bin. It's really good to have conversations around the links between capitalism and mental health issues, or whatever term you want to use. I think often there's a lot of mention, oh yeah, you know, mental health and modern life and productivity, culture, and all the self-care stuff around capitalism, neoliberalism, but often the discussions doesn't get any deeper than that kind of superficial level. So this seems like a really good opportunity to get a bit deeper. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Vesper and Rhiannon are going to talk about, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion after the break. Before I get stuck in as well, I just want to say that I'm going to be talking about, the way I'm going to be talking, I think is going to come across a bit dry and heavy, and you know, that's kind of where my head is at tonight, and has been for a while. So, but you know, I just want to kind of say that a lot of what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to share with you today, we had a lot of fun coming up with these ideas. That Recovery in the Bin, one of our key principles is this, and I'm just going to read it out. We reserve the right to ridicule and satirize what we dislike, rather than always respond with reasoned arguments, which can get a bit boring and it's bad for our mental health. So, you know, there's a strong streak of quite dark humor in what we do. And that's probably a great way to start a talk. It's something about engaged philosophy when we're not always wanting to respond with reasoned arguments. So this talk is going to be kind of 3 rough parts. I'm going to talk a bit about how I got involved with Recovery in the Bin, because I think that kind of explains a lot about what Recovery in the Bin is and what does. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the group itself and what we've done. And then I'm going to focus, and most of the talk is going to be about on recovery, which is a concept we came up with that has, you know, we found really helpful. And actually revisiting it for tonight, I found it kind of yeah, really rich, and something I want to kind of get back into thinking about. As I said, I've got 2 slides which I'll share towards the end. I'm not going to mention COVID or current events. My head really isn't in the right space, but maybe the discussions will help us kind of see what the connections are. Does thinking about what's happening now actually help us understand on recovery? Is on recovery a useful tool to understand what's happening now, or to resist it? So we'll see where that goes. As I said, I'm going to start with how I came to Recovery in the Bin, and I came from it from a place where I had once been a great fan of recovery. I had come across it in the early 2000s when the concept first came to Scotland. It really excited me. So one of the things that really excited me, well, there was a couple of things, but the main one was that it actually came from people with their own lived experience. So recovery was this concept that came from America, from people like Pat Deegan. Pat Deegan was someone who at a young age, at 16, she was told, basically she was written off. She was told, as a quote from her here, many of us who have been psychiatrically labelled have received powerful messages from professionals who in effect tell us that by virtue of our diagnosis, the question of our being has already been answered and our futures are already sealed. So people like Deegan resisted this. It took a lot of individual effort and support to get past this message psychiatry had been giving them. Basically, you know, it's hospital and medication for you for the rest of your life. Don't dare aspire for anything more. So having heard about Pat Deegan and having heard about the idea of recovery, it really excited me. We too in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK have been told that medication hospital was all there was for us, not to expect too much. And getting involved in survivor and service user activism in the 90s was part of fighting back about that. We challenged these ideas. We worked to get more seats at tables where decisions were made, to change minds, to change policies and practices. So when I came across recovery, that seemed to be encapsulating what we were asking for and what we were campaigning about and what we were fighting for in one word. And that word gave us a way of understanding what it was we wanted, and it offered, it wasn't just a word, it came with a movement, with community. There was people thinking and talking about it. And to me, in the early 2000s, this was the answer, this was the way forward. And I got very involved in recovery activities locally. So to me, it was a kind of a defiance against psychiatry and against mainstream ideas in society widely about what it was like to have a mental illness. So kind of just to kind of define a bit what was meant by recovery, probably the definition I've used most and is quite widely used is from the Scottish Recovery Network. And they describe it as recovery is being able to live a meaningful and satisfying life as defined by each person in the presence or absence of symptoms. It is about having control or input into your own life. Each individual's recovery, like his or her experience of mental health problems or illness, is unique and deeply personal process. So that sounds great. I mean, who doesn't want more control over their life? Who doesn't want to define what a good life is to them? But over time, I was beginning to have my doubts. And one moment that always comes to me was I was at a kind of an event, and we were all talking about how wonderful recovery was. We had somebody over from America talking about what they had done, and somebody stood up and says, "This is all about cutting benefits." And I was like, no, it's not. It's not about cutting benefits. And little did I know that was what was going on in the background. So I kind of moved away from recovery, moved away from activism for a while, kind of because I was just so frustrated where things were going. It wasn't where I thought things were changing, but they weren't changing the way I thought they were going to change. They seemed to be changing in ways. How they were changing seemed to be, this is what people have saying they're wanting and we're changing things, but actually it didn't feel like, even though there was more people involved in user involvement and things, it didn't really feel to match what most people were saying, but we were told it did. So when in 2015, I came across a notice in Asylum magazine. I don't know if anyone has heard of Asylum magazine. I'll put the link in the chat when I've finished. And there was a wee notice in there saying a group had been set up called Recovery in the Bin by people who were frustrated with how recovery had been co-opted. So I thought that's a group for me, and I joined them. So kind of the co-option of recovery, recovery came into kind of discourse around mental health sort of in the early to mid 2000s. And at the same time, neoliberalism was really getting a grip. Kind of starting with New Labour, and a lot of people forget that a lot of the welfare reform and austerity was actually started by New Labour. I remember in 2006 when they were still in power, they kind of feeling really frustrated and wanting to do some kind of research into what was going on in people's heads, because the way benefits were being talked about and people on benefits were being talked about, I thought that must be doing some serious damage to people's own internalized sense of self, let alone what was going to do to their ability to live. So I do know it goes back to New Labour, and there was a lot of ads and campaigns around benefits scroungers starting back then, but a lot of people don't remember that, and they pushed it all down to the coalition government. So neoliberalism, as Sab mentioned earlier, was taking a grip, and what was going on was the relationship between the state and society was being changed. So the state was getting narrow. It wasn't about supporting people anymore, if ever it was, and it was also getting deeper. So we had this strange situation where we were given more and more responsibility for our own well-being, but given less and less support to make it happen. And of course, the state was able to provide all the resources in the world for private business and big corporations, and we're less and less wanting to give any money at all or any support to ordinary people. So as part of this, recovery was being reframed and co-opted to support this idea that people were too dependent on benefits and on public services, and that they need to be made less dependent, and to promote the idea of paid employment as the most significant factor contributing to positive mental health. Even some advocates of recovery at that time were even saying that benefits and being on benefits and using mental health services were bad for your recovery. Whatever about using mental health services, being on benefits for 10 years had a huge part to me having some kind of recovery, in that it gave me space to develop. I was able to have long-term psychotherapy on the NHS, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I'd been in a paid job, because it was very intensive. And most people who dropped out of it was because of conflict with their having to work. So yeah, benefits aren't always a bad thing if they're enough and they're reasonably secure. I came off benefits in 2013. I came off ESA in 2013, and honestly could not imagine having to go through that. I've seen so many people struggle with claiming benefits now and going on universal credit. It's horrendous, and it's a lot of what our work in Recovery the Bin is about now. So it seemed that something like recovery, which was a challenge and an alternative to mainstream mental health services and thinking, soon became something that started putting responsibility onto the mentally ill person to recover in ways that fitted the demands of neoliberalism. Services began to focus on independence for people with mental health problems, which in practice meant short-term interventions, outcomes determined by services and policy, and discharging people as soon as possible. Alongside this, the punitive benefits system, of course, was focusing on getting us off benefits, regardless of the cost to us individually. And at the same time, this kind of very narrow co-opted version of recovery was denying the effects on our mental health, which was kind of a form of gaslighting, really. So Recovery in the Bin, when it got started by some people who've been involved in the survivor movement in England for quite a long time and who were frustrated with what was happening. One of them told me she felt like an outcast when she went to other survivor events because she was kind of critiquing recovery. So when Recovery in the Bin started, one of their kind of key statements were read as follows: "We believe that this rise," can't remember what the rise is now, but anyway, it's a symptom of neoliberalism, and that a meaningful recovery is impossible for many of us because of the intolerable social and economic conditions such as poor housing, poverty, stigma, racism, sexism, unreasonable work expectation, and countless other barriers. The underfunding and under-resourcing of mental health services means that service users are under pressure to conform to a narrow idea of recovery. The changes to the social security system promote the idea of work being good for everyone's health, while undermining any real hope of a good life, which recovery is supposed to be about. So Recovery in the Bin argued for a robust social model of madness and distress from the left, placing mental health within the context of the wider class struggle. We said that we knew from both experience and from the evidence that capitalism and social inequality can be very bad for your mental health. So now I'm going to talk about on recovery. I must be very clear, on recovery does not mean anti-recovery. It comes from Alice in Wonderland, when Alice was talking about an on birthday. I think it was Alice. It was one of the characters was talking about, birthdays and on birthdays. So playfully, as we were playing around with these ideas, somebody said, "Oh, what about on recovery?" So we developed this as a way of articulating the complexity of our concerns around how recovery was being co-opted and how our lives were being shaped by that. We found by actively engaging with the idea of on recovery that we are better able to psychologically resist the dominant neoliberal discourses around mental health, recovery and employment. So as I said, it's not anti-recovery. We wanted something that it wasn't, I kind of see it wasn't up against recovery. It was kind of like moving around recovery, finding another space to be in rather than recover, not recover. We wanted something to explain why we disagreed with individualized entrepreneurial recovery regimes, because some people it was all about business, it was about really individualistic stuff, or the state-sanctioned coerced recovery through mental health services and through and through welfare reform. Most of us have been involved in recovery in some way for years before austerity come along. So we weren't against recovery. We'd seen some good things about it, but we wanted to acknowledge it wasn't always possible. It was very dependent on people's situations and circumstances. And as I said, it wasn't a binary between permanent recovery or failure, not recovering at all. And that to deny all this was punitive. It was punishing people for not fitting in these very narrow confines. So anti-recovery wasn't the term, but on recovery was the term. So on recovery, it's a position of resistance and opposition towards the imposition and authority of recovery-based ideology that's prevalent to mental health systems and just how mental health is talked about in society as a whole. We consider unrecovered as valid and legitimate as recovered. It doesn't mean that we want to stay unwell or ill, whatever they may mean, but that we reject this new neoliberal intrusion on the word recovery that has been redefined and taken over by marketization, language, and outcomes. At the simplest, it's just kind of a way of thinking. It's just a kind of helping you find a space that you're not having to fit in, and find ways of doing things differently, and what we call practices. So there could be artistic practices, kind of highlight the work of Dolly Sen, for instance, who's a survivor artist who does some really interesting stuff around welfare rights and lots of other things. And again, that's a link I'll put in the chat when I've finished speaking. It's about kind of resistant practices. It's about talking at things like this and engage with academic or research. It means kind of supporting somebody to go along to a medical assessment. It's about speaking out on Twitter against things like some very coercive, I don't know if people have heard of SIM, which is a very punitive approach to people who have complex needs, where basically people are being criminalized for being extremely suicidal. So it's about standing up against things like that. It's about speaking out against abuse in psychiatric services. So there's all sorts of ways that you can be kind of doing on recovery work, and sometimes it's just surviving, and it's about supporting each other and sheer bloody mindedness. And some people say that the main thing that stops them killing themselves at some stages is just to not give the DWP or others the satisfaction of seeing them die, which is quite harsh. But yes, thank you very much. Someone's put a comment there about stop sim. Thank you. So sorry, I'll just kind of scroll past my notes. So some of these things might actually help lead somebody to something that could be called recovery, but it's not assumed to be the inevitable consequence, and there's no sense of failure if the person doesn't. And it just makes me think a bit of how so much is seen as good for your mental health now, whereas before you do something because it was fun or you were interested or you wanted to do, or there was nothing better to do, and now it's all, you know, is it good for your mental health? You know, everything has to be good for your mental health. If it's not good for your CV, ideally both. And it's just a kind of way of, instead of simply living and, you know, doing things, it's about trying to package them in approved, socially approved ways. So you can no longer kind of dig the garden. You're kind of involved in, you know, gardening is so good for you. I'm in touch with the soil, and yes, that can be true, but it's kind of a way of packaging everything. To kind of fit into this idea being good for you. I'm getting stuck a bit here now. So yeah, it's about kind of making everything kind of therapeutic and seeing everything through that narrow lens, instead of just kind of, these are human activities, these are things we might do, as I said, because there's nothing else to do, because you enjoy them, or because whatever. So it kind of imposes a certain way of looking at things that a few years ago people just did. One of the things about on recovery is that it's kind of connects a bit with the refusal of work movement. I don't know if people have kind of come across some of the critical, the critiques of work, that so often in the left we're talking about having better jobs and better conditions in jobs, whereas the refusal of work is kind of critiquing the whole idea of paid work, and that values unpaid productive activity, childcare, emotional labour, and it's not about work for just to make a living or work to kind of generate profits. So we're especially critical, and on recovery as a tool is critical of austerity and service cuts. It doesn't consider, you know, the whole idea of being dependent on benefits is ridiculous, because they're so, you just don't get enough to live on. So you know, this idea of people are just sitting around having an easy life while they claim benefits is ridiculous, and as I'm sure most people here will know. So, you know, we oppose those kind of right-wing views, the stuff you see in the tabloids. We see social security as an active resource and human right for those struggling with ongoing mental health, mental distress. And we generally we consider on recovery as a kind of class-based practice of everyday life. It's a profound way of understanding our current situations and of being able to exercise some agency in a structurally unjust world in terms of political activity and looking after ourselves collectively and individually. It's a way of introducing the social and political causes of distress back into the picture. It critiques the normative idea of illness, deviance, and so on, by scrutinizing the idea of work as a healthy thing to do and seeing the damaging impact of employment on us. So on recovery can help us resist these ideas. It's part of upsetting the normative individualist ideas of recovery. And just as we are not against people being well, we're also not against the idea of self-care. That's not the point. The point is that's all there is. And if it's a very narrow capitalist, consumerist idea of what self-care is. It's clear that, you know, that within the group, Recovery in the Bin group, the kind of solidarity and connection and humour and the support are key things. And that's part of our recovery for us, having a space with one another to understand our experiences, therefore feel less alone and less crazy, self-care of a kind that challenges the dominant prescriptive ideas from services and wider. So now I'm going to share a slide. Because I'm going to talk about something that's a bit visual. Right, hang on a minute. You think I'd be used to this by now? 18 months on Zoom. Here we are. So I'm showing you a star with 12 points. In the center of the star, it says on recovery. And at the end of each point, there is a word or a phrase. So we've got things like racism at one spike, economic inequality, discrimination, transphobia and homophobia, sexism, unstable housing. I can't see that. Hang on a minute. Loss of rights. I can't see the top one, but I'll come back to it. Loss of welfare state, trauma and iatrogenic trauma in particular. And now I'm just going to go to my own on recovery star on my screen to see if I can remember the top one. Poverty. How could I forget poverty? So I'll just explain about this. So the on recovery star was kind of a bit of fun. We came up with it in response to something called the recovery star, which was a measurement tool for that some services were using to see where their clients were on this recovery journey. You know, and some of the measures were very individualistic measures. There were things like, you know, ability to manage your money without really reference the fact you might not have very much, relationships, employment, you know, managing symptoms, taking medication, those sort of things. So it was a bit of fun. We sort of say, oops, sorry, just go back. I'll just come out of it altogether. So we, you know, as we were having fun with it and thinking what should go on the end of each spike and thinking that we needed like more than 12 spikes, you don't have spikes and stars, 12 points on this star. We could have had like 30 points. We actually found it a helpful tool to outline the impacts on us of politics and discrimination of all kinds. And people actually told us that they took the on recovery star to their community psychiatric nurse or a support worker to talk about what was going on for them, as opposed to what, you know, what the kind of narrow tools of individual recovery were bringing up. And some workers were really responsive to it. They really made sense to them, and not just for the person they were working with, but they're, you know, all the other people they were working with. So we kind of see this as a social justice tool, a means of advocacy to try to address your real needs for housing, welfare, advocacy. We can also, we've been using the On Recovery Star to spread the word about what we do, to campaign for greater social equality, protest against psychiatry and what we've called psychocompulsion. Psychocompulsion was a term that was developed by Lynn Friedel and Robert Stern to describe what was going on around the welfare to work thing. This whole idea is particularly around the kind of mid 2010s about work being good for you. You had to kind of it's not just about you have to get a job or you have to join a workfare scheme, but you had to have the right mentality. You had to be happy to be at work. You had to do all that emotional labor of kind of being kind of all motivated, excited and excellent at your job. It wasn't just not good enough to do your job. You had to be like excellent and passionate about it. And some of the things that were happening in the DWP when people went on these kind of back to work courses.
Just to let you know, there's about 5 minutes.
Excellent. I should finish just before that then. So we, you know, it clarifies that humans are social beings, and the determinants of distress are to be found kind of not just in ourselves or in our immediate circle of friends and families. Too often families get and neighborhoods get kind of pathologized, but it's actually wider society and politics. So the value of their own recovery stars, that demonstrates that we need to not just pay attention to distressed people, but to deal with the problems that surround us in communities and wider society, that mental health is a profoundly political issue. So, excuse me, I've actually rushed it a bit more, and I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes, but that's good. It just means more time for other people. So I think on recovery still matters. I need to think about it now, where it is in 2021, as opposed to sort of 2018 and 19, when we were kind of really working hard on it. So much has happened since then. So much of the bad stuff has just continued around conditionality of benefits, cuts to benefits, cuts to services, increasing demand on services being less and less actually therapeutic. But then there's also the new stuff like what's happened with lockdown and COVID and the impact that's had on not just us as individual people who have mental health issues, but the whole discourse around mental health. It's really quite, everything's getting kind of medicalized and individualized. There's some kind of reference sometimes to like we've been through this kind of shared trauma, but the response to it is all these apps where you can get therapy or mindfulness and nothing about actually something shit's really happened. A lot of people have suffered, and the responses need to be collective and need to be political. And I'm not even talking about all the stuff around the corruption, about private businesses getting bundles of cash from their friends in government that actually don't provide anything for them, and then it being blamed on the NHS, like with the Test and Protect app. So much has happened, so much has carried on getting worse, so much new stuff has been stirred up. So I'm just wondering, does On Recovery make sense to us now? I think it does. I think it provides us a little bit of headspace to sort of think differently. I'm just wondering, does it make sense to other people? Does it make sense of other issues? Is there kind of other kinds of concepts or phrases or terms that help us make sense of how capitalism impacts us in other ways? So thank you for listening. I hope some of that's kind of kind of tied in with what the others are going to say. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. That was a really brilliant and important talk. Yeah. Okay, so next we've got Rhiannon Firth, who is a lecturer in sociology at UCL Institute of Education. Her research is at the intersection of political theory, sociology, and education, with a focus on the pedagogical and prefigurative practices of social movements and utopian communities. She is interested in radical forms of grassroots action and resistance to structures of domination, and will be presenting on neoliberal anxiety. So Rhiannon, I've got hi. Yeah, I've got your recording. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything yourself about it first, or I can just play it straight away.
I don't know if I've got much to say about it first. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you for that amazing talk that Anne just gave. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think there were a lot of connections to what I'm going to talk about. And I did pre-record the talk because I was invited to do so. I think had I given it live, I maybe could have drawn out more of the connections, but I think we're going to have some discussion at the end to do that, aren't we? I just hope I don't repeat too much, because I feel like that was such a fantastic talk and there were so many sort of commonalities between some of the things I'm saying. So I hope it's not too repetitive, but I think having done the pre-recording, I'll go for showing that, if that's okay.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay.
I can't really hear anything. Is it the same for other people?
Yeah, the sound isn't working.
Okay. Wait, let me just stop. Don't know how. Could you hear anything, or was it just really quiet?
No, it was just silent.
Oh, okay, so maybe I need to allow sound or something.
So I've just turned the sound up on the Zoom settings. Like, thanks for that recommendation. I think that like it should be a bit louder now. Maybe we try it again.
Okay. Oh, what?
Yeah, this is still really quiet. Okay, I'm not sure.
We have we might need to change your audio input from your microphone strings. Okay. Oh yeah, okay.
Now you're quiet.
Actually, what you can do is if you go to share, there's 2 buttons below that says optimize for video and audio. And if you click that, you should be able to get it. I don't know if you had missed it, but I learned that recently. So
Thank you. Is what, because I'm clicking on share screen, I can't see an optimize option.
So when you click share screen, you're gonna have that window that pops up that shows you all the windows. And then below it's gonna say optimize, click that one instead of just images.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Hello, my name is Dr. Rhiannon Firth. I'm a lecturer in sociology at UCL Institute of Education. My research is at the intersection of sociology, education and politics, with a focus on the pedagogical and prefigurative practices of new social movements. And I've conducted lots of funded research with social movements, and I also do theoretical and historical research on social movements of the past. I'm the author of 3 books: Utopian Politics, Coronavirus, Class and Mutual Aid in the UK, and a forthcoming book, Disaster Anarchy, alongside several book chapters and articles. So today I'm going to be presenting an adapted version of a paper which I published several years ago now, but which I feel has become even more relevant in the context of the contemporary crisis of capitalism caused by COVID-19. You can read the original version of this paper, open access, in the journal Ephemera. And I'm really excited to have been invited to present at this exciting event on neoliberalism and mental health, which is precisely the topic of the paper. I'll be critiquing some of the ways in which neoliberalism sort of construes and affects mental health, as well as looking at some radical alternatives. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, hopefully. If I can figure out how to do this. Share screen. Oops. Not that. Okay. So the paper is called Somatic Pedagogies, Critiquing and Resisting the Effective Discourse of the Neoliberal State from an Embodied Anarchist Perspective. Most of my research I write from a sort of anti-authoritarian anarchist perspective. And the movement I look at in this, somatherapy particularly, has origins in anarchist theory, amongst other things. Okay, so a summary of the paper I'll be presenting today. I'm going to give some context on what anxiety is in neoliberal society, and how neoliberal society produces anxiety in particular. I'll be looking at affect and the conformist subject. I'll give more detailed explanation of that terminology, which might be unfamiliar to some people. I'll be looking at well-being, resilience, and therapeutic education. I'll be looking at the neglect of the body and some of the critical alternatives that exist. And then I'll have a look at some alternative pedagogies of the body, or somatic pedagogies, which is the title of the paper. Okay, so neoliberal anxiety is a term that I get from the Institute for Precarious Consciousness. I get the conceptualization from this article by the Institute of Neoliberal Consciousness that was published in 2014. I'd highly recommend that article to anyone, probably even more so than my own article on this. The Institute for Precarious Consciousness gives a history of kind of the ways in which capitalism has affected sort of mental health on a kind of social level, and they argue that the rise of industrialism was characterized by misery, and they argue that one of the best accounts of this is sort of Marx's account of the immiseration of the proletariat. The later Fordist period of sort of massified capitalism and very monotonous factory jobs and a universal but bureaucratic welfare state was very much characterized by boredom. There was an amount of security, but work was very repetitive. And they argue that the contemporary period, the sort of post-Fordist period, work has become more precarious. We see a lot of zero-hour contracts, sort of algorithmic management in sort of companies like Uber, withdrawal of benefits, and sort of the sort of receding of the welfare state, continuously impossible targets that people are set that just aren't possible for people to meet, and basically just sort of the financialization of the economy and so on, leading to global outsourcing, and things are just everybody's capitalism is in crisis and people's lives are precarious, and this causes a huge amount of anxiety, and that article explores in depth many of the reasons for this. Okay, so affect and the conformist subject. So affect is a term that's used a lot in sort of critical sociology and social theory, and it refers to emotion, relation. It's sort of a holistic concept. It refers to more than just emotion, because emotion's quite an individualized concept, but affect is something that sort of flows through bodies, to do with sort of structures of society, structurations of desire, and so on. And it's about the sort of interaction of bodies and the relations between them. And affect theory tends to draw heavily on philosophers like Spinoza and Deleuze. So in my paper, following some other theorists, I argue that the state, the neoliberal state, as in the government, which seeks to sort of support, it's a state in capitalism that seeks to sort of support and stabilize capitalism, uses discourses of affect to harness biopower. So basically the kind of discourses the state uses around our feelings and emotions and so on are created to produce and reproduce compliant subjects who are able to deal with the anxiety that is produced by this kind of crisis-prone capitalism. So at the same time, there's been a turn to affect in critical academia. So as I say, this idea of affect is very popular in critical sociology. And these theories attempt to produce critical pedagogies. By pedagogy, I mean sort of forms of education and learning that are able to resist state-effective discourse. So critical sociologists try to show us ways in which we can identify and critique and resist the ways in which the government seeks to mobilize our mental health and our sort of feelings and desires in ways that support capitalism. However, in the paper, I argue that the problem with some of these critical pedagogies and critical perspectives is that they elide or diminish the role of the body in effective resistance. So even though they're critical, I argue even critical academia neglects the body. So well-being, resilience and therapeutic education. There's a very popular book by Eccleston and Hayes, Catherine Eccleston and Dennis Hayes, called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. They cite a deluge of interventions throughout the education system that assess the emotional needs and perceived emotional vulnerability of children, young people and adults, and claim to develop their emotional literacy and well-being. Now, throughout this paper, when I talk about education and pedagogies, public pedagogies, I'm not just talking about what happens in school, I'm also talking about what happens in the media that also educates us as adults, I guess, and popular culture and so on. All of these are sites of education and learning. So some examples, in primary school, we've had philosophy for children classes, which include interventions to assess the emotional needs and perceived vulnerability of children, and interventions to develop emotional literacy, aspects of citizenship education, and personal, social, and health education. In colleges and universities, there's been induction programs, modules. The induction programs often sort of contain an emotional or well-being element. There's modules that claim to build self-esteem and confidence in their kind of descriptors. And we also see student satisfaction surveys, as though satisfaction is, student sort of experience and satisfaction is some indicator of learning in a sense. It's sort of, the idea is that students should be happy and enjoy their learning, that it shouldn't be sort of uncomfortable for them, which is problematic because critical learning can often be uncomfortable because it involves being confronted with difficult things about the world. But often, you know, when student, you know, when lecturers, for example, are measured and sort of disciplined according to how happy they make the students, you know, it can avoid, it can encourage us to avoid more difficult subjects or uncomfortable subjects. In the workplace, we also see activities to deal with stress, harassment, bullying, appraisal and performance reviews that focus on emotional well-being. So the idea is that we sort of have to be happy at work, and that's a sort of moral good rather than, you know, it's sort of, we have an obligation at work to be happy and so on. Also in cultural pedagogies and popular education, we see an abundance of online psychology tests and self-help books and so on. So all of these are sort of the ways in which neoliberalism construes mental health as a kind of public and moral obligation, I guess. Okay, so thinking of some recent examples, certainly with sort of, it's a long time ago now, but when there was the sort of new Labour government, Blair and so on, there was a huge, this is when this sort of focus on well-being seems to really come to the fore. But with the Conservatives, there seems to be more of a focus on kind of panic and fear and securitization. But there still seems to be a focus on emotional intelligence, and resilience is a very important keyword. We also see it in research funding bodies. So I'm going back a while now, but the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council's strategic priorities from 2011 to 2015, had a theme of influencing behaviour and informing interventions. Now, obviously that's a while ago, but we can really see the ways in which that became, that kind of research is absolutely dominant now in the ways in which the coronavirus crisis has been sort of managed. There's been a lot of emphasis on shaping people's behavior, controlling the ways in which people react and behave. So this sort of nudge theory, gamification and things like this. So the idea is that well-being is about willingness and ability to work, and underlying all this is a desire to reduce welfare expenditure. If you put the obligations and responsibilities for mental well-being onto individuals, then you know, it removes it from sort of being a public obligation. Furthermore, discourses of discipline and securitization that we've also seen a lot of during the COVID crisis also mobilize affect in the form of fear. So they rest on the same assumptions of vulnerable subjects in need of state protection. So the state is there to sort of control and protect us, but at the same time, it sort of withdraws material support and so on and places those obligations on us. We can see some examples of this in counter-terrorism adverts, like sort of this picture here: family home, drugs den, terrorist cell, and then it's got some doorbells. So, you know, we're to be afraid of doorbells now and suspicious of one another. There's a quote here from the government which very much equates well-being with the ability to work. It's not about how you feel or, you know, your ability to meet your own personal values and goals and aims, or your community values, goals and aims. It's very much about your ability to meet society's needs. But by society, they mean capitalism. And this is very much embedded in even sort of interventions with children, you know, this idea of resilience. So if we move on to thinking about more recently the relevance for the coronavirus crisis, this sort of, everyone will have seen this: stay alert, follow the rules, we can control the virus. So it's very much it's like the gamification of health. Health becomes a sort of personal responsibility in which the sick are perceived to have failed. And it's very much the same with mental well-being. The idea that, you know, we have to just pause, take breaks, make time, reach out. It's our responsibility to reach out and seek help. But it also very much treats everyone as the same in a way. So it doesn't talk about things that like class or inequality, the idea that you can stay safe and stay home and just reach out to others, and these are sort of options that are available to everybody, completely ignores the fact that home is not a safe place for some people, or some people are unable to reach out to other people because they don't have anyone, or it very much places the responsibility on the individual, but treats the individual as a kind of generic sort of capitalist node. Okay, so let's think of a critique of these pedagogies. I call them pedagogies because they're teaching us. So the government is teaching us forms of sort of preparedness for disaster that are very individualized. And they rest on assumptions of a diminished self that kind of requires assessment and intervention. So it's a kind of social engineering. It creates a culture of narcissism, vulnerability and isolation, and diminished agency. This is all from Eccleston and Hayes, by the way, but I'm on board with their critique. I'm not necessarily on board with their alternatives. It's an insidious means of surveillance and control. So often, like wellbeing interventions at work are used not to help people sort of feel more fulfilled in their life in the sense that sort of maybe person-centered forms of counselling would, but they're actually used to sort of assess and survey workers. It's also an individualized discourse that channels subjects towards narrow neoliberal desires and conceals the social and material causes of anxiety, rendering them what's called a public secret. So everyone knows that they're anxious, but they don't know that everyone else is. And that's used to control people. Okay, so critical pedagogy and the politics of affect. So therapeutic education, these therapeutic interventions in education that appear to have our best interests at heart, you know, mindfulness and all these things we can do for ourselves to make ourselves able to cope with frightening work conditions and so on. They raise some specific issues for critical theorists and educators. So if students and populations are trained to accept, adapt to, and ultimately desire precarious life in neoliberal societies, how might we persuade them otherwise without us also presuming that these people are diminished and in need of our intervention and control? So how do we help people become, how do we raise consciousness without imposing our own desires or for sort of criticality and radicalism or so on people? So some existing alternatives in critical academia include Sarah Ansler's fantastic work on developing critical awareness of the role of emotions and affects and problematizing emotional responses to critique. So the idea here is students can become emotional and uncomfortable when dealing with critical pedagogies. And that ties into what I was saying about student satisfaction not necessarily being a very good indicator of learning earlier. Also, there's some great work on opening non-hierarchical spaces for discussion and engagement with otherness, and I'd highly recommend the work of Sarah Motter on this. And there's a large body of literature on pedagogies of affect and emotional pedagogies and so on that talk about acknowledging a role for unpleasant affects and emotions in class, for example, ambiguity and discomfort, when talking about the ways in which we've been sort of, you know, our desires have been shaped by neoliberalism, the way we've been abandoned by society and so on. You know, these are difficult topics for many students. So the neglect of the body. So my I think original contribution to this body of literature is the idea that all these critical pedagogies, which are fantastic, are based on discussion, dialogue, and critical thought only. They assume that emotions are discursive rather than physical in origin and effect, and they maintain a mind-body dualism and hierarchy. So they maintain a very strong split between the mind and the body, which I dispute. So I feel like we have to bring the body in when we're talking about mental health and emotions, and this is affect theory. The sort of theories of effect by Deleuze and Spinoza and so on would say the same, that there isn't this sort of split between mind and body that's often presumed. So my wish is not to supplant these ideas, but to supplement them. I also wish to maintain emphasis on non-hierarchy and openness. So rather than trying to program people with alternative desires, radical desires, it's about opening up space for people to explore their own critique and desires. So I've looked in history and elsewhere in society, which is the methodology I usually use in sort of radical social movements and historically, for non-hierarchical and liberatory pedagogies that invert or transgress the mind-body dualism and dynamic, and the idea that the mind is more important than the body, by beginning from the reconceptualized body. And one of my favourite examples is somatherapy, which not many people have heard of. I completely accidentally ended up at a workshop, and it was one of the most sort of profoundly liberatory experiences I've had. It was absolutely fantastic. And this is something that was invented by a Brazilian psychiatrist called Roberto Freire, not related to Paulo Freire, the originator of critical pedagogy. It's a different person, but he's absolutely fantastic. I'd highly recommend his work. Unfortunately, not a lot of it has been translated into English. And he was an anarchist. He was explicitly anarchist, and he invented this he invented this therapy that draws on the radical psychology of Wilhelm Reich, and also on the Brazilian martial art capoeira. And it uses physical movement and dance to help us unlearn the musculature armor, he calls it. And that's very much drawing on the work of Wilhelm Reich, that capitalist life and work imposes on us. So the idea is that our job, whatever that is, if it's like me sitting at a computer all day, being a researcher, or whether you're working in a factory, obviously it gives us a sort of bodily rigidity, which is very much implicated in our mental and physical health, just as much as kind of the anxiety that neoliberalism imposes on us. So his desire is not to develop athletic bodies, but to rediscover bodily difference, autonomy, and build collectivity. He aims to mobilize affects of creativity, trust, and feelings of freedom, starting from the body. And his sessions often end in a critical discussion about the affects that have been aroused by the session. Also, another example that I think is really useful to think about is theatre of the oppressed, which is another pedagogy created by Augusto Boal, which aims to change spectators, the sort of monologic version of the theatre where you have the actors and then the people who are sort of passive spectators, into actually being actors and transformers of the dramatic action. Again, similarly to Freire, he talks about how alienated and repetitive labour imposes a mask of behaviour whereby work governs the body. So the first task of liberatory theatre is to raise this to a level of consciousness and study and analyse the different forces that affect participants' bodies. So he uses a variety of exercises and games. Again, these are very sort of embodied things rather than simply being about sitting in a chair and discussing. There's also the sort of critical or radical tradition of psychogeography, which involves exploring the effects of the geographical environment on human behaviour through a variety of playful strategies like walking and mapping through the urban environment. And this is from the work of Guy Debord. And there's various examples of these. I'm going to skip past these now. There's also some academics have written about the role, the potentially liberatory and radical role of dance and music. And I love having a good dance. So I definitely agree with that. And I think these works have a lot to say about how we can resist anxiety and neoliberalism and sort of build a collective subject and critical consciousness. And somebody crying very loudly in my street outdoors, which seems very relevant background for this presentation, but it's quite sad to listen to. I'm not sure what's going on there. I don't think you can hear it, but I can hear it. Okay, so conclusion, key themes. The state, in attempting to produce compliant neoliberal subjects, uses discourses and affects designed to capture the affective force of fear and anxiety, often cloaked in discourses of well-being. Critical pedagogy attempts to resist this in educational and cultural settings through a counter-discourse of affect. But as I said, this often involves people just sitting down and discussing things as though it's an intellectual problem. So what I argue in my paper, which I hope some of you might go on to read in Ephemera Journal, as well as the article by the Institute of Precarious Consciousness that I draw on quite heavily in there, what is missing is a somatic understanding of affects that takes into account the whole body and its relationship to disalienated level. This opens up possibilities for pedagogies that begin from movement, dance and play rather than from language. I've got a list of references here. I'm not sure, I'll make sure that these are available to the organisers in case anyone wants to follow them up. And I'd highly recommend, if anyone's interested on somatherapy and the life of Roberto Freire, I'd really recommend this documentary, which is available on YouTube. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'm really looking forward to attending the event and answering questions and being involved in discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rhiannon. There were some really, such interesting points in there. Just have a quick chat. Okay. Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll deal with like all the questions in the panel. Okay, so next we've got Vesper Moore, who is a speaker / educator, mad liberation activist, and psychiatric survivor. They have been advocating as a part of the psychiatric survivor and mad movement for several years and have been the recipient of many social justice and diversity awards, as well as serving as the keynote speaker at several international conferences. Vesper, as a mad, queer, Indigenous person, has made it their life's mission to rewrite the narrative psychiatry has enforced on our society. Cool. Just
Hello, hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here with you all today. And actually, if I have permission to share screen, I am going to share just visually the principles of disability justice, which will kind of be key to my speaking points today. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with the principles of disability justice, they were created by Sins Invalid a few years ago. Sins Invalid is an organization that prioritizes the performance art for disability activists and disabled folks alike, and it really speaks a lot to how capitalism, neoliberalism specifically in our society, it is of a significant impact, but particularly takes away from the disability justice perspective, which is what I will be really kind of encompassing on. Specifically the MAD disability justice perspective. And when I say MAD, what I mean is madness as a means of identity outside of our existing system, our existing capitalist system. And the idea of madness is that there is an idea around mental health where if you are extremely, mentally ill, in quotes, that you are perceived a certain way. And there's this almost like this unspoken spectrum that is measured through things such as the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, which the Diagnostic Statistics Manual has over 300 categories since the development of the DSM-5. But I'm going to be really speaking about mental health as it exists in a MAD disability justice perspective, which means that it isn't about how there is something wrong with us inherently because of our state of mind, but rather there is something that is wrong with our society that means that it is not accessible to us in the ways that we exist. And something I really appreciated that Rhiannon had shared earlier was the split of the body and the mind. And the disability justice perspective, we really talk about the mind and body in a lot of contexts. And just to start here, the idea that neoliberalism as it exists in our society really focuses on this idea of individuality and individual contribution as a means of productivity, which is kind of a theme that we've been hearing throughout today. But that what this does is that it actually, it isolates us. It tells us that our value is inherently tied on to what we can produce as human beings, which then leads to this feeling of, do I have any value to society? Am I actually a worthy or contributing member to society? And also this idea that we have to live alone, and that if we're not living alone, we have to live and produce and create a self-sustaining environment or family, and that we have to live to this specific standard societally. But going back to the point on madness, when we talk about mad identities and the reason why there's a reclamation of this term, very similarly to queerness, very similarly to the term crip, again in the disability justice community, or how there's been a reclamation of a lot of terms. The reason why is that madness indicates against convention, against the conventions of society, the cis heteronormative conventions of society that we see in a larger neoliberalism scope. So what that means is that when we're talking about what is mad to our society, it is anything that doesn't fall under the guise of what is acceptable or socially acceptable in these ways, which means that, you know, for example, being a BIPOC person, a Black, Indigenous person of color, or being a queer person, or being a trans person, you know, that those inherently fall out of what is considered socially acceptable. But, you know, you don't have to just take my word for it. You can look at a lot of the mental health diagnoses that have existed historically. You know, the diagnosis of homosexuality, which had existed till about 2007, or the diagnosis of asexuality till about 2013. The diagnosis of transsexuality for many years, or diagnoses like drapetomania, which was, you know, Black people who would run from, in quotes, would end up running from their slave masters if they were mistreated, and that was a condition, and that also the condition was if a slave master was too kind to a Black person, that it would create some form of illness. On top of that, another diagnosis that was created by the father of the American Psychiatric Association, Benjamin Rush, which was negritude, which is a form of leprosy, believed to spread subservience onto white people if they were too kind or were within too close proximity to Black people. So a lot of these things have existed historically, right? A lot of these forms of oppression. So when we take a lens of how do we as a society really break away from a lot of these damaging aspects around neoliberalism, it's really taking an intersectional approach, because we cannot, in fact, acknowledge any of these things till we talk about the overlap and intersection of human identity as it exists in our society. And I think another piece of intersectionality, if you look down here, there's a quote by Audre Lorde that we do not lead single issue lives, regardless of how you exist in society. There's going to be a multitude of issues and a multitude of social class identities that you bring into a space that will be inherently impacted when we discuss things such as collective access and liberation. So a big part of this is when we talk about that contribution of productivity and we look at disabled, mad, neurodivergent people historically, we're also thinking about how there's been this idea that if you don't contribute well to our society and you are perceived as a danger because we are afraid of your state of emotional distress, or afraid that we cannot contribute in the same ways that we are expected to, right? By extension, because something may happen to us, or we may receive a diagnosis, or we may become disabled in our lifetimes, which is something that is statistically very high, that we will not be able to produce in these ways. And then by not facilitating and contributing to these means of productions, that all of a sudden our value and contributions no longer matter. And that's when we really get into kind of what we were talking about earlier, which was the idea of recovery putting personal responsibility on people with mental health diagnoses, and that idea that it is your individual responsibility to recover so you can get back to that production and needs in society, which is why we really focus on the idea of interdependence in disability justice, which is working together as a means of, ensuring that as many of us have access to the information that is needed in different spaces, making sure that spaces are physically as accessible as possible, and ensuring that informed consent is a big part of the conversation when we talk about mental health. And inevitably, we can't have a conversation about access if it's not led by those who are most impacted by inaccessible and inequitable spaces, which is inherent in neoliberalism. When we talk about inaccessibility and the fact that we're focusing on individual contributions and privatized funding, breaking out of government, there's going to be a lot of means, a lot of policies that will not consider the multiply marginalized or many oppressed identities of people who exist in many different communities. And then a big part of that too is wholeness. When we think about this idea of wholeness, what actually are we speaking to when we think about treatments and supports and things that exist in communities? Often because of this hierarchical structure that exists in our neoliberalist society, that we as communities cannot decide the very supports that we need for each other, and that often this holistic approach of a community on many different levels supporting each other isn't thought of or really considered. It often has to be, or is often considered that it needs to be in the hands of the paid professional who has studied those who are most impacted, and veering away from the leadership of those folks. And then when we talk about cross-disability solidarity, it is the idea that often in the mental health system and in a mental health context, how we veer away from that social model of disability with the idea of mental illness and a mental illness framework. What ends up happening inevitably is that as a means to bill for individuals who have mental health diagnoses, and how that billing and means of diagnosis has replaced identity and how we view ourselves. In a lot of respects, how, for example, a diagnosis like schizophrenia can be thought of as a debilitating illness that one would, in quotes, never recover from, and then would have to be on medications, and consume for one's entire life, right? Rather than the idea of what means of distress or types of things that have happened in a person's life that may have led to them hearing voices. What are the small inherent genetic factors? What are the means of environment that have led to the forms of oppression that a person may experience inherently that may lead to the experience of hearing distressing voices? And this is when we get into colonization and society as it has existed in indigenous societies historically across the world, and in many contexts, about how many people who have experienced distress or are hearing unusual voices or having these experiences would often be guided by an elder in a tribe or someone who can work with them. That collective approach is frowned upon in the ways that our society exists today. I think overall it's very important about how sustainable a lot of the approaches are when we talk about a disability justice approach. We place ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained long term. Our embodied experiences guide us toward ongoing justice and liberation. The idea that we continue to work together and that these movement ideals are sustainable. And something that's very important at its core is that when we talk about the idea of how mental health and mental health treatment puts that individual idea of recovery on people, then you are to believe that I cannot exist and contribute in the society in a certain way unless if I achieve a certain degree of recovery and maintain it, rather than how can our society have a better understanding of my distress and how I struggle with things and the generational forms of trauma that may have led to me being here. And inherently, when we talk about a means of production that a person can contribute with either their body or mind, that inherently a disability justice approach is really breaking away from the idea of you are not productive because of your state of being, you are lazy in these ways because of stress, right? The idea of laziness, and that inherently that approach must be anti-capitalist, something that exists in direct opposition of the idea of your value is contingent on what you can provide. So I do not have any more to present. I do want to open the floor to any questions people may have at this time.
Cool, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm thinking if we do the break now and then we'll reconvene at 8:15, and then we can deal with all the questions. And yeah. Cool. Okay, so see you in 15 minutes at 15:15. Thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Right, I'll pin the 3 speakers. Okay. Okay, so yeah, let's start the panel. Yeah, so I was thinking the way we can do it is if people have questions, if you can just write Q in the chat, and then when I say your name, you can just unmute yourself and say your question, or if you don't want to speak, then you can just write the question in the chat. And yeah, feel free to ask questions to particular people or just for the whole panel. Yeah. Okay, so we've already got a question from Nadia. Says, I have a question for all three / whoever would like to answer. Content note, colonialism, racism. How do we bring spirituality into the medical discourse on mental health? My work in decolonizing mental health has often found a crossover between mental health issues and spirituality, my own experiences, as well as in research. In some indigenous groups, for example, like the Dagara tribe in West Africa, who see psychosis as a form of spiritual interaction and have been successful in supporting an American ex-psychiatric patient who ended up living in the community for 4 years because of being normalized there. Of course, indigenous perspectives are infinitely different and are not all homogenous, but I've seen a pattern of spirituality and mental health as a theme that comes up a lot. But the medical model of mental health and practitioners will often mock and ignore spirituality, and I think that also explains some of the issues. So question, how do we integrate spiritual notions into the medical mental health models for those who need it? Okay,
I
yeah.
love this
Whoever wants.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm jumping in. So I love this question because the Dagara tribe were the exact people who I was referencing when I said elders who guide people through hearing voices and things like that. And I think the integration of spiritualism is more and more important when we talk about the conversation of community mental health. The World Health Organization just recently released a manual on community mental health, and the United Nations has been talking more and more about it. There have been special reporters of the United Nations in the past who have spoken out about psychiatric violence and oppression prior as something that's very evident. And with that, the need for more community-led approaches. So I would say a part of the advocacy, both in the academic realm and just largely in our society, is when we have conversations around community mental health, that we have more and more that really speaks to outcomes when it's spiritual approaches or communities working together, more and more evidence, or rather failing to disprove that community approaches are effective in a lot of means and in a lot of ways. So I know that's kind of a vague answer, but it's kind of just to say that the more and more we validate community approaches, show their effectiveness in the community, and link that to spirituality, the more we're going to be able to be like, hey, this in fact works. It works well as a preventative intervention, but more largely as a means of harm reduction. So.
Hi, I think that's an amazing question, and I'm not from a mental health background or a psychology background. I'm from like a sociology of education background, but one of the things I'm really interested in is sort of social theories. So I guess I'm trying to think of a social theory that might offer something here. And the one that I can think of is autonomous Marxism offers ideas of social recomposition. So I'm thinking about like indigenous communities and spirituality are more integrated with their ecosystem and then their community. And I think maybe one of the reasons that for a start, political movements are difficult and people are alienated and people's political views are alienated is because of capitalism and the way in which capitalism has dispossessed communities through gentrification and through monetizing us as people and labor in the same way that it monetizes the environment or whatever, and then just displaces us all into wherever the place is that is profitable for capitalism. So, you know, I'm in a place that isn't where my parents grew up, and it isn't where any kind of spirituality occurred, and it isn't, you know, where any kind of substances that I can grow and eat. And, you know, I'm here drinking a glass of wine from Aldi, but, you know, there might have been, you know, I'm so disalienated from the processes that produce this wine that I'm drinking that, you know, and I'm on my own on a computer talking to people on Zoom. It's like, is this drinking alone? Is it alcoholism, or is it acceptable? I don't know, you know, but it's certainly not a spiritual experience, and it's not, you know, so for me, it's about recomposition. It's about recomposing, because you can't go back. You can't go back to where are my ancestors from, like, you know, Scotland, the Highlands, whatever. We can't go back, you know. And they had some spirituality, and there were indigenous spiritualities in my family, but that is so long gone. But we can be inspired by people who still have that. But then I think there's also sort of ideas around recomposing communities, and that has to go hand in hand with ecological kind of like communities as well, and sort of growing things together and forming new experiences and new spiritualities. But I agree that spirituality has to be an enormous element of that. Like, I think that alienation and disalienating, processes of disalienating, which I think Anne's talk of unrecovery to me resonated with my idea of what I'd call disalienation. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
I'm not sure I've got a huge answer for that, but I just kind of doubt. I think spirituality isn't a huge part of my life, but it is so important to so many people, and I'm not sure the medical model and medical system can actually cope with that kind of complexity, or that you know, it's not about numbers, it's not about, you know, I can't really explain it, but I just think it's kind of, it's almost like too different, and I think that's part of the problem for people and within the system. And also there's a danger, I think, sometimes, and I've seen this quite a lot around other survivors, is that people get interested in other cultures, religions and spirituality, and can quite easily pick and choose the bits that they like, and totally disregard where the context in which they come from. So I think we need to be very careful how we learn from other cultures and not kind of appropriate them.
Thank you. Okay, next we'll have Rosie. If you want to unmute yourself and say your question, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll put my video on as well, just so it's not coming from a black screen. It's a bit cheeky, really, but myself and at least a couple of us on the Zoom today here are actually as students. We're studying mental health nursing at Allen on the other side of Sheffield at the moment. We've both had our own experiences as well, which I think have led us to studying that. And it's interesting. We're in our first year. I think you'd probably be quite pleased to know that I think they're quite deliberately taking a biopsychosocial approach, and as they say, and that they're talking about social determinants, but it's got its limitations. And I think my question really comes from, and I think this would be especially, to be honest, for Vesper and Anne, because I know you said that you have spoken to some nurses and health professionals, and they've been quite open to this, is whether you have any advice for us, because I think it's really hard going into this, really understanding massive limitations and the services that we're going to be going into, especially in the UK. But I think we want to integrate these ideas as much as possible. And yeah, so it's a cheeky question, but any advice or anything that you've had any experience with health professionals on the other side would be really appreciated. So thank you.
I always start with trauma-informed approaches. I mean, a lot of, you know, it came primarily from white psychiatrists and physicians who spoke to the concept of being trauma-informed, even though the root of being trauma-informed has existed in many other contexts in society. So I want to be transparent about that. But I do want to say that officially in service systems and a lot of different systems, I think, you know, there's more and more around trauma-informed approaches being evidence-based, that and the very notion of that being trauma-informed is you're trying to be as informed about the impacts of trauma that exists on a widespread, indirect and non-direct scale on every person that exists, and that communities can come together as an effective means for that approach, and if not communities, that sometimes, you know, intentional conversations of shared experiences where the conversation is as least traumatizing as possible, which, in order to have a trustful conversation, right, generally, if you're speaking to someone who may have an understanding of what that experience is like, it can be helpful. Now, disclosure is something that's very important in a lot of different settings, and when we have these conversations, and I think it can be important that even though you're not directly disclosing, that you can speak to having some type of understanding of it. And it can be important as well that when we're considering these experiences, that we consider the approach of what does informed consent truly mean, in a lot of regards. Is there actually a thing as informed consent when someone can, for example, be, you know, involuntarily hospitalized, or go in voluntarily and not choose when to leave, you know, and when we speak about medication in a lot of these regards. So I think advocacy can be important. I think transparency first, from the position you come in, a position of power, right? A position of what you do and don't report, a position of what you can and cannot share, is extremely helpful. And having critical conversations that are also connecting, I find helpful as well.
I agree with everything that Vesper's saying, and I'm also sort of thinking from base, because I have spoken to a lot of student nurses and gone into universities and spoken to student nurses, and I think one of the things I would, based on what they've told me, is kind of find people who get the reasons you're doing nursing, and keep find the people who are talking about the dilemmas in nursing, because often when you get into service, you're kind of, the culture of that service will actually change how you practice unless you're very careful. And part of that is you've got to find the people who are in nursing, who are doing the things you think are worth doing and are good. I think being transparent about the power imbalance is very important. Too many well-meaning professionals in my life said, "Oh, but we're all equal," until they didn't, you know, and it's just, you can think about, I'm equal worth as a person, but I have power in a situation because of the role I'm in. But you've probably got that. But yeah, just look for other people who doing what you want to do, that can back you up and support you when things get tough. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of all. Practically, when you are practicing, when you're out there as a nurse, if people need your support to claim benefits, to write letters, tell people when you go on placement, staff, how important it is. Writing benefits letters and getting evidence is so important to people actually having enough money to live on. So and don't wait till go and speak to anyone you meet when you're on practice about the importance of that, because I can't begin to say how important it is when people get good medical evidence for DWP.
Thanks, both.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll just scroll back up. Okay, I've got a question from John. It says, after neoliberal capitalism, what predictions read? What are the routes or forks in the road for future mental health? Is one route personalized medicine, biotech dystopia, and another maybe more hopeful? Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything more, John. Or,
I could probably talk about that a little bit. Yeah, because my main topic is utopia and thinking about utopias, and I don't predictions. I'm not in the business of predictions. Like I love the business of imaginings and fears, and look sort of visualizing those. Recommend all sorts of novels about beautiful futures for mental health, and like I can also imagine lots of horrendous futures for horrific biotech dystopias. And yeah, no, I don't know. I don't have predictions. I can't do predictions. I mean, predictions is about what we do ourselves. And I suppose as an anarchist, my interest is in the fact that we all have to think about not only our own complicity and responsibility to society or the world, which is too much, but our own like complicity and responsibility within ourselves, and how do we recompose our own communities. So how do we start from exactly where we are and then make friends and make people and make an ecosystem and, you know, grow whatever we can with whatever we're capable with doing. And so I think like a prediction is too much, but, you know, prefiguration is an anarchist concept, which is about making futures starting with what we have and then sort of reiterating and growing in the best ways that we can, I suppose is the best I can do. And like using utopias in the sense of what have other people imagined, what are other people's novels or imaginations or other people's spiritualities or other people's communities, or, you know, what have other people managed to do that can mean inspiration. But we all have to start with literally what we have, which for some people is less than others, and that's really hard. But I don't think there's another way to do it, if that makes any sense.
You know, just to add, I think it's define biotech dystopia. I mean, I think I feel as if we're already partially there, if not completely so. And I also think, you know, it a lot of means those when we talk about that conversation. And I was speaking to informed consent earlier and a lot of those things. I think that there's a massive place to be spoken to around misinformation and disinformation and the regulation of human information and human data through like social media. And for example, how much you click, how long you're focusing on a screen, looking at an advertisement, how that then, you know, really feeds into what you end up looking at next and what is next advertised to you and how it is sculpted around you and your mindset and how it continues to feed. And then there's a sense of anxiety that you feel because you're overwhelmed, right? Looking at the screen and how all of that is environmental and being fed to us more and more now. And I also think in the regard of the advancements of, and I put advancements in quotes, of pharmaceutical medications. There's a new form of Abilify. I think it's called Abilify XM or FM. And it's a type of pill that you take, right? And the pill lasts like in your body, I think like 48 hours about. And it monitors whether or not you are taking all of your medications, and it reports it to your psychiatrist and your primary care. And it is being released by a private institution and not a public. And it is not regulated, you know, by policies or law, you know. So there's dysregulations too, right? To the privacy of information, the things going into our body, many of these things. So I think that that's a very, very critical point when we talk about biotech dystopia, and we're talking about if we're going there. I argue we are there.
Cool, thank you. That's really interesting. Anne, did you want to say anything, or should I move on? Okay. Right. Oh yeah, we've got a question from Dylan. Oh yeah, I forgot to say as well, if you want to follow up on something, just put S in the chat. Okay, so question says, do you think that as movements supporting all historically overlooked causes come, I'll read it again. Do you think that as movements supporting all historically overlooked causes come forward into the mainstream and curriculums get amended to be more inclusive within upcoming generations, internal equality will increasingly become the normality? Or will there always be a subtle line somewhere that, whilst accepting, won't allow for seeing us all as the same community? Is there a kind of subconscious bias where, for example, an individual of a minority group's actions can be stereotyped as being representative of that community? However, an individual's actions within a majority community stays as the individual's representation and doesn't get seen as a collective representation. Thanks for the wonderful insights.
I could say something about that, but I went first last time. So if someone else would like to go first, I'd welcome it. No? Okay. I mean, my main thing would be this idea of representation, and these words like inclusion, representation, mainstream, and so on. They're all incredibly politically loaded terms, but only if you're an anarchist. If you're not an anarchist, like they can fit into every other form of political form that I know, you know. But like the idea of inclusion, it's like you have to be included within a consensus or a democracy or the idea of the people. But if you're an anarchist, the idea is that like you don't have to be included, you know, that you don't have to be represented, your voice is your own. And like all anarchist senses of what politics is, like you can be oppressed as an anarchist, but you're being oppressed, you know. Even if you're in an anarchist system, it's possible to be oppressed, but being impressed, you're not being included or represented. Like it's impossible to be represented as something that is not yourself. But you can be persuaded or like all sorts of other things. So like there's an idea of consensus. So there's this anarchist idea of consensus, which is that everybody has to talk until they agree. And like I did my PhD in intentional communities, and some of them did that, and people don't believe that happens anymore. I had an argument with someone on Twitter recently who said that, oh, there's no type of political system that doesn't include voting. And I had a big argument with them because it's completely false, because the idea of voting presumes it's like one individual, one vote. So like you've got a decision and everyone has to come in and say, oh, I agree with that, by putting their hand up. But rather than everyone playing it out, talking it out, feeling it out, whatever happens, you know, until everyone either agrees or the group separates or something changes. And it's very much about group size, you know. So if you're in a nation state, that's a certain size, and that's to do with the socio-technical framework that you live within, which is to do with how you're powered, or, you know, all sorts of things. So I don't know, I'm very much for political degrowth being essential to and anti-capitalism. So political degrowth and anti-capitalism being essential to mental health, basically, in the sense that you can't be included as a full and holistic person unless you have a direct relationship with your environment and the people that you're making decisions about your environment and your space with. And that requires a sort of small scale, but different people have that's a controversial opinion. So I'll hand over now.
I think it's fascinating that in our neoliberal society that we can in fact sell the idea of anti-capitalism to the people. And the fact that sold idea of anti-capitalism doesn't actually stick to the roots of what it is. It's generally focusing on the surface of social issues to create a certain level of dissatisfaction that can also create distraction for different social issues that are impacting us today. And I think that is it's so important to watch out for when we talk about, you know, movements in the mainstream, really, and the idea of working on these different issues becoming the normality, right? So what is important is that one, yes, we're recognizing social issues and we're trying to prioritize them. Will there ever be a point where we become increasingly more equal? Arguably, I think there will always be inequities that exist regardless of what system and society we are in. I would say that basically from the historical context of observing fascism, communism, and you know, neoliberalism as it exists in our societies. And as I look at them, I see how inequities have existed in different contexts, given the inceptions of all of these political groups and ideologies. So, and regardless of how they have started, right, we still have these inequities and these discourses that exist. And I use the term equity very intentionally, because I don't think that we will have a society that is inherently equal. We will always be meeting people where they are at different points, given the contexts in which they are oppressed. There will always be a group that is held down to support the public interest of another group. And if we reach a point that is not there, we can easily return back to it. So I think it's this idea of if we work towards a more equitable society, that it'll be consistent maintenance, it'll be consistent checking in, it'll be consistent discussing it to the fullest degree, as Rhiannon was talking about, having a full conversation about it and continuing to work it out on individual and collective levels. I do think human beings are inherently collective. Creatures are inherently community focused, and that isolation works against us. But we've also weaponized collective approaches historically to work against us, and I think that that's something important to highlight as well. I don't know if it answers your question, but I'm just saying that you know, I just historically, in a lot of contexts, I don't foresee just an equal society and in the first place, but if it were equitable and we were meeting people where they are and we were getting to a point, right, that it would need consistent maintenance, if you will.
Hi, I'm just kind of going back to that word inclusion and kind of wondering, included into what? And I think on recovery, in a way, is a bit about kind of like saying we don't want to be included in on this very conditional idea that we fit into a very narrow idea of what it is to be productive in work, not dependent on the state, fitting certain criteria. I'm also sort of thinking about stereotypes and how we've had all these anti-stigma campaigns, certainly not every English language speaking country, and probably a lot more that I don't know of, like in other cultures. And in some ways, yes, it's easier to talk about mental health now. It's easier to be open. And it's so long since I got told I was brave for talking about having a mental health problem, but it used to happen all the time because it was so rare. But you know, has our condition really changed? I think what happens is it just becomes individualized even more, and the people at the hard end of psychiatry, people in forensic units, people are still kind of seen as dangerous, and the understanding isn't extended to them. So it's kind of conditional inclusion. If you kind of fit a very narrow idea of, oh, I was poorly, I got some help, I took my tablets, I'm back at work, you know, I'm happily getting on with life. And lots of people's experience doesn't fit that. So yeah, and in terms of like, I just can't imagine a world where human beings aren't finding differences and being, you know, those differences leading to inequality. But then, you know, this is the life I led, and this kind of imagination can only take me so far. I would like to think something else is possible. And I think Rhiannon was talking about like looking at reading novels and finding other ways of thinking about the world, because we do have a very narrow idea of what it is to be human and what it is to live together. And I think we've got to be aware of that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I think we had a follow-up from John about this. Says how to increase real choices, preferences and options and settings, especially in the crisis situation and during the reactionary moment. Yeah. Do you want to speak more about it, John? Or maybe we'll just go from there.
It's the idea of my experience is that in the mental health system, there's like two tracks. Like there's the kind of, when things are going slow, and then there's when things sort of, the heat is on, or when the crisis moment. A lot of things change in that the hard heads called upon. It's that sort of, there's two tracks, two ways of doing business.
Yeah, I mean, I think our society is inherently, we don't sit with danger well, and we don't sit with risk well, and we don't often sit and try to have conversations that are inherent around human distress, suicide, self-loathing, hatred, loneliness, a lot of these things, and we often detract from them. So I think, in order for us to work away from a more reactionary society, that for one, we need to speak more to things like suicide, human crisis, states of emotional distress, and move it away from the taboo. A lot of this then gets into the idea of mandated reporting and what contexts that exists. I believe in the UK, suicide doesn't fall under mandated reporting. In the United States, it does. So that is something that we often face is like how do we break a lot of the taboos around those conversations? But even conversations around like I'm sitting in this anger and I'm very afraid that I might hurt someone else because I cannot control it, and really being able to speak through it. Of course, there's always fear for our well-being, right? Which is, if you remember, the trend in neoliberalism is this focus on well-being a lot and really speaking to that. And that's not to say your well-being isn't real. It's just that fear is also programmed. That it's imperative that we be able to, again, on a community level, be able to have conversations earlier and earlier on about distress. My organization, the Kiva Centers that I come here representing today, we have a peer-run respite that's called Karaya. It's the Taino word for moon. The Taino are an indigenous people. I am a Taino person myself. And the moon is symbolic of rest and all of that. But we have people who leave emergency rooms, who are actively looking to harm themselves or others, who come into a home that we operate, who manage their own medications. There's no form of restraint, and they can come and go whenever they please, right? And it is run by survivors of service systems, for survivors of service systems. So the beautiful thing about that is that people are like, that doesn't work. What do you mean that they're going to talk about wanting to die? Wouldn't they just jump out the window? Wouldn't they take a knife from the kitchen? Wouldn't they do this? Wouldn't they do that? And there's always a very real risk that might happen, but to be allowed the dignity of risk in an environment, a microcosm society, has really actually shown that oh wow, now that I have the option, and I have the conversation and consistent support and validation, I kind of want to less, right? I'm hoping I didn't veer off. I'm trying to look back at the question, just make sure I answered all of it. Real choices, differences, especially in the crisis situation and reactionary moment. So yeah, I think it's difficult to sit with danger, but I think it's always important to ask, what type of support do you need at this moment? And then really work from that. I think we don't do that enough. I think often we're concerned about the liability and risk to the institution rather than the person involved.
I just wanted to say something about, I totally agree with what Vest was saying, that we do need space to talk about these things in a non kind of, oh my God, you're going to kill yourself, we need to do something, which is usually something that isn't very helpful, to say the least, and often can be incredibly traumatizing and just increase your risk later on. There's a number of cases where women in particular are suicidal, and they get told it's not in your interest to get any support or help at all, and they later go on to kill themselves. And then there's a lot of hand wringing in an inquest, and still this idea goes on. It's predominantly women with a borderline personality disorder where their risk is suicide. It's really messy, and I find it hard to talk about. But in this country, certainly there is this kind of, it's called positive risk taking. And then what happens is some people get referred to SIM, which I mentioned earlier, and somebody kindly put a link on it, where it becomes, people become criminalized in the name of helping them. It's really messed up in this country, and it really, I just get so angry when I hear all these things about just go and talk, just go and talk. Every time I've talked about it, I got nowhere. It was kind of, it would either be incredibly punitive or it would be incredibly dismissive. There was no kind of, let's talk about what's going on. What would help you right now? None of that kind of common sense thing that I think most people, if they felt confident, would respond with. But from professionals, it's either nothing or everything. It's either dismissal or punitive.
If I can, just very briefly, with the mad neurodivergent disabled people, you know, and when we speak largely to our community, that the idea that that we are self-determined or able to work through situations on our own is something that is not often discussed. And I think something that is so important is that under a historical context, the criminalization of mad neurodivergent and disabled people is something that's very prevalent. Just today, earlier this morning, I was watching a panel discussion for a man who was up for execution in Singapore. They were going to hang him. He was a disabled man who spent 10 years in solitary confinement. Really, really, really horrible thing. So there were a lot of circumstances to a situation. He had heroin on him, and he was brought in for trafficking said heroin, but he was someone with a mental health diagnosis and an intellectual disability, right? So that changed things around the case, but Singapore's government doesn't really have a lot of the same regulations and laws in place for people with disabilities. And that is to say that the fact that consideration isn't there, and it's like, oh, okay, no sane, in quotes, person would these ways, and if they did it knowingly and all of this, that is the inherent interlinking that being mad in our society is inherently criminal. And I don't know if you're familiar with the saying, be gay, do crime. But I often say be mad, do crime, because to be mad in our society is already inherently criminal, just like being gay was, just like being trans is, just like being any of any marginalized, oppressed group is.
Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, I'm loving this conversation. I'll just go back up because we had a question earlier. Oh, okay, yeah, Tom, do you want to say your question? You can unmute yourself.
If you can see me. Right, here I am, good. Well, thanks for the discussion. I've learned so much. Just in, you know, I was very interested, I think it was it Rhiannon? Oh dear, sorry. Talking about the efforts that some institutions go to discuss things like resilience. And I would just say that I think in Sheffield, I had some various seminars that were organised during the pandemic that I found quite useful.
So obviously, I agree that there's often an agenda behind a lot of these initiatives, but sometimes they can definitely be done with good intentions, very helpful. And if they're dialogic, if we've got a group of people who are discussing and sharing experiences, they can be very helpful. I think that's perhaps why Anne was saying it's not, people don't say she's, brave when she talks about having mental health issues, because that, progress has been made. I think, that's something that, I would, underline, because certainly for me, these are conversations I never had previously. And I think that's positive that, more people are getting involved in these sorts of discussions. Just with me, I mean, my background is in sort of intellectual history and Russian studies and stuff like that. And I don't want to sort of talk about my specialism, because it's not really about that. But just in terms of some of the stuff about dance and about dialogue in the 1920s, just after the Russian Revolution, people like Meyerhold, who's a famous director, he was Eisenstein's kind of teacher. They would go to the theatre, and for the first 45 minutes, they didn't rehearse any lines, they didn't rehearse any scenes, they just did movements. And Meyerhold, he would have a pole, and he would put this pole, if you can see, he'd put this pole on his nose, and he'd balance it for like minutes and minutes and minutes. And that's what these super famous directors, actors were doing. It was just like, it was dance, it was like sculpture out of people, it was a bit of ballet, it was all sorts of stuff. And they did have this idea that we should break down, who's the audience and who's the participants. And so I take the point about the negative image of, communism, where you did have this, bureaucratic elite and so on. But that would be, perhaps for another discussion, in terms of, what is the future? Because that question did come up in terms of the utopia, dystopia. Hang on, let me just. And so my question specifically is about, if we talk about social movements, and what are the kind of collective forums where people can come together and share experiences and put forward alternatives. I think certainly in Britain, there's a role to discuss the role of trade unions and maybe the Labour Party. I don't know how familiar, maybe you guys are more familiar with than I am, but at the Labour Party conference in September, they did put forward resolutions about provision for mental health, about precarious work, and all sorts of other resolutions against the private sector and the health service. So I'm just wondering, maybe. So I just know some, slightly vague stuff. Maybe some of you guys have got some more kind of concrete examples of good work that people are doing in the trade unions, maybe in the Labour Party, maybe in other social movements, where there's kind of alternatives, maybe small scale examples of how we're able to kind of change things at a local level. Like Rhiannon was saying, specifically at a local level, I think is very important. So I hope I've been clear, and thank you for the great discussion.
I can think of a couple of interesting things. There's an article by a guy called Rich Moth, who teaches at Liverpool Hope, I think, and he's written about how trade union and service users came together to not just to campaign to save a service, but to make it better. So it's worth looking him up. In terms of, I really don't want to say anything about like the Labour Party without, it'll sound negative, but I really don't put much faith into what they might have said in a conference around mental health. I think politicians are great generally, all parties saying, oh, more money for mental health, but it's usually, if there is more money, it's usually more of the same, and a lot of what's available now is a problem. So I don't think giving it more money is such a good idea. Yeah, but there are examples of trade unions doing some good stuff. All right, so the conference resolutions for members, not politicians. Yeah, I still don't hold out a whole lot of hope for it. I'll just type his name in the chat. The author
Yeah, I mean, I could say a little bit, you know, with the when it comes in terms to the Labor Party, and it comes in terms to uh, um, to advocates who work inside the systems, which is generally an employed role, and you know, when they or a volunteer role, you know, sometimes comes in the effect of peer support, and um, what that means is, you know, someone shares their own experiences with the mental health system, supporting others in the mental health system, and what often happens with the Labor Party is, and more particularly with the unionization of different professions, and when we talk about peer support professionals, the unionization often leads to a lack of the consideration of nuance to different traumatic experiences that individuals may experience, and how someone may have to work in different circumstances. What that means is that often when you're a change agent working inside of these systems, and doing the groundwork, that you require to operate off of a certain set of ethics, a code of ethics, if you will, that that often in circumstances where you might be in an inpatient setting and you're trying to maintain a mutual relationship where you're not coercing someone into taking medication, but your your supervisor may very much say that, oh, okay, you need to convince this individual that they should be taking their medication, and that often, you know, when in that role, there is no line of defense that's really saying, okay, for that nuanced situation, like you can't like force someone to be on their medications. I mean, other examples of groundwork when we're talking about mental health and social movements is often policy work. I think policy work is huge. Again, when I was speaking to the principles of disability justice, to have groups who gather that really speak to policy and are individuals who have been impacted by that system, I think is so important. You should have more than 50% representation on a board and committee of people who have lived experience with that service system. I think when organizing and really considering what efforts will work and which ones won't, you can protest institutions like psychiatric institutions that incarcerate people and have historically for a long time, but you may find that that institution isn't going to shut down anytime soon. There isn't anything else that's going to happen. But what may work is if you challenge a licensure board and you challenge their definition again of what is consensual and what is non-consensual and a lot of their practices. If you speak to insurance companies about what grassroots community mental health would look like, you know, those are some examples of groundwork that I have done or that I've seen.
Yeah, just I completely agree with all of that. And I was just thinking when I think it was Tom asked about the Labour Party and social movements, I was thinking about the difference between the social and the political, which is one of the big sort of distinctions that anarchism makes, and Kropotkin. And the difference between a political movement is that it's like hierarchical and it has vested and bureaucratized interests. So discourses like inclusion and so on would be relevant for a political movement because it tries to compose a kind of community that's almost an artificial community because it's trying to sort of speak to another community. Whereas a social movement, it's a more spontaneous thing where it absorbs the shocks that these more hierarchical systems place upon us. So I don't think I'd call the Labour Party a social movement or even unions a social movement. Like social movements are people giving each other mutual aid spontaneously without cohering behind a named cause. So I think like social movements don't necessarily have named mental illnesses or, you know, named forms of inclusion or named institutions. The social movements absorb the shocks and the mistakes that those systems leaves behind in a way. I can't remember what the original question was, but the sense in which the the Labour Party is able to do that, I think, requires that distinction between what I'd call a social movement and then what I'd call a political movement, which would be the Labour Party. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. This is really good discussion. Yeah, my Zoom on my computer's actually crashed. So I've gone on my phone. So I can't actually see the chat from before because yeah, it's just started a new chat for me. So just wanted to check, was there another question that I missed in the chat, or was it? Okay, we've got one from John. Right, okay. What is capitalism's response to mental health treatment? What are the capitalist contours which hold that medication is the main game in town versus food, social support, exercise, talking, etc.?
I mean, capitalism's response to mental health treatment definitely has been medication as the main game, but also has utilized therapy and different forms of talk therapy as forms of social control. One example that I often use is in an industrial setting. So, for example, when you have an industrial therapist who might be working with for example, a realtor, and that realty company has purchased an apartment building, and the people who are currently living in that apartment building are paying, you know, a pretty decent amount for their home where they live, and they don't want to move, and you know, they've been there and they shouldn't have to move, but they're being made to move, right? But they're not leaving willingly. You can, you know, a lot of these industrial psychologists can then come in and work one-on-one with a lot of these people. Work, I'll use in quotes, one-on-one with a lot of these people in the apartment buildings, and then introduce them to wellness and mindfulness practices that can say, you don't need to live here. You can live anywhere. You can take care of yourself. You will have better options. You need to believe in yourself. You need to do this. And the weaponization of mindfulness and wellness to make them leave their apartment for the realty company that paid those psychologists. I use that example because capitalism's response to mental health treatment, I think, is the very use of mental health as a means of social control, as an avenue to work in the interest of private industry.
Basically, capitalist responses. Sorry, I had that up. Basically, capitalism's response is, where's the profit? Where can we make money? Obviously, medication, there's huge money in there, but there's a whole industry of psychology and wellness stuff that people are making loads of money and, you know, used against people.
Yeah, I think another good example of this is when you, and I think I'm going to use housing a lot because housing is a really big part of this. Here in the United States and Massachusetts, you know, we've been seeing a lot of people who are living outside of tents in communities, operating on their own, and often those communities are being dismantled, and a lot of these people living in tents are being given eviction notices and are being told that they need to leave, even though the sidewalk in a public area belongs to the community, belongs to everyone, but they're being told that it's unsightly and that you shouldn't live there and that you need to go, and you know, all of these ideas. And often those unhoused people who live there are the people who are using substances, struggling with their mental health, right? They are the mad, the traumatized, the disabled, the neurodivergent of our society. And because they are treated as problematic, and that because, you know, because of how the community that they built does not exist well within the confines of the capitalist society that we live in, that they now be like, oh well, you know, they're using drugs over there, it's not well regulated, we can just shut it down, we can just do this, and we can displace them wherever, when in fact they just end up taking all of their tents, right, and they end up sleeping in that same spot in the sidewalk without a sense of any safety or security at all. And you know, I you know, we witnessed this recently when we had gone out to one of these communities, that they had a large shredder that was literally shredding these tents with families crying nearby. And these are, you know, you talk about, you know, like how our society is approaching mental health. I don't know what's more distressing than losing the makeshift home that was probably your last means of living in some type of security and privacy, and that no one cares about you, and that you can sleep on the cold sidewalk instead.
Yeah, totally. Someone, who was it? Sherilyn wants to say something. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah, we've probably got time for that question, and then I know Anna had a question, and then I've got a question as well, and we're probably done. Sherilyn, did you want to unmute or type your question?
I got myself unmuted. I live here in the Midwest, and farmers out, I live in Kansas, and farmers out in Western Kansas started killing themselves because, you know, the land they've been living on, they can't figure out how to support themselves because, you know, the big food manufacturers get the money, but they're not getting money. And of course, the response is they're going to send mental health services out there. And it would seem, of course, I'm just sort of making a statement, but it would seem to make more sense if, when people are productive and do something so necessary as to provide food, that they would be rewarded with an income. But small farmers, I'm not talking about big corporate farmers, small farmers, and you can be relatively sizable and still not be able to make a living. And it's just like what you're saying. I feel like mental health is being used instead of saying people ought to get paid enough so they can live. Mental health is being used, well, we'll help you mentally. And these people don't need mental health help a lot of times if they could make a living. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherilyn. I was glad you're able to joining us from the Midwest of the United States. Just wanted to clarify because there's people from all over the world here. So, and you know, I completely agree. I mean, you know, we expect people to focus on their mental health recovery, right? We're putting it on them, and simultaneously, there are a lot of these systemic and social circumstances that exist, right? That the cost of living is far too high. It's, you know, it's 3 times your salary, and there's no way you'll ever make it there. And that, you know, the expectation that maybe if you are offered some food that you might get there. But I think, you know, the actual issue is in response to people being unhoused, we should be using space to house people. And that could be the first point of then, you know, working on being connected to different resources, or staying away from the re-traumatization and the circumstances of living outside. There's a lot of people who are working full-time overtime who are unhoused. You know, I've seen people who are living out of a tent. They have their motorcycle just outside, right? And they drive to work in the morning. They work all day to drive back to that tent, and hopefully have enough food to just make it through. So, you know, I think food is a part of it, but more importantly, shelter. You know, there's so many public spaces that are not used in the evening that we could be utilizing. There are so many vacant homes that are, you know, out of affordability that could be used in a different manner. And yeah, I'd say the response for the unhoused and the poor is to offer housing. So.
Thank you. Shall we move on to Anna's question now?
So I think we had one follow-up
Yeah, I didn't see.
from John. Do you want me to read it out? Because I just have it in front of me.
Yeah.
Would you differentiate between small-scale business capitalism and the monopoly multinational capitalism version and their mental health contributions? I think that was a follow-up on the discussion just now.
Sorry, I just typed an answer to John, but I don't think you can have two different capitalisms. I think the whole point in capitalism is it's this like monolithic system that we all exist within. So you can't really say, you know, these people are existing in one capitalism and these people are existing in another capitalism. We're all taking positions within capitalism, and we can resist capitalism, but we resist it from the position that we're at. So you know, if we wish to monetize people, we're monetizing people. If we wish to take a position on mental health, we can take a position on mental health which is monetizing it from a position of capitalism, or we can take a position on mental health which treats it in a sort of decolonial perspective, which is like, you know, trying to find a way to connect with ourselves and our fellow beings, which is beyond the monetization of them, I suppose, and objectification of them. So yeah, I don't think there's a difference between a big business and a small business and what they're contributing or doing. I think there's, you know, there might be a difference between the way in which a person in a small business treats another person in a small business, or there might be a culture that's developed around a small business, but that's nothing to do with business or capitalism. That's to do with people and culture, I suppose. That would be my answer anyway.
Yeah. And just to add, I'd say, you know, in the prison or the psychiatric facility, that if you don't keep all of the beds full, right, if you don't bill per individual, or you have enough individuals to bill for, you don't have a reason to pay into that property, to invest into power of that property, or invest into a certain amount of food, right? Your funding might get cut from different public, you know, spaces. So what do you have to do? You have to institutionalize and incarcerate more people to keep your prison or your psychiatric facility full. And you can see a parallel of this with small nonprofits who need to bill per individual, and how that exists with insurance companies. And then what ends up happening is you have this revolving door effect, right? And then those small nonprofits end up feeding the larger mental health industrial complex of those prisons, those psychiatric facilities, those nursing homes, those juvenile detention facilities. And, you know, they go hand in hand. They're monolithic, as Rhiannon had described. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a question. So there's been like some talk about, like earlier on, about like prediction and kind of like being able to like imagine a different way of living, and like Rhiannon, you mentioned like looking at fiction and stuff like this to try and imagine different ways that we can live. And like something that I think about a lot is this sort of like deterministic worldview that like I really think is quite a capitalist construct. I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts about like the link between like determinism and mental health. So like this idea that, yeah, everything can be predicted, and there's sort of like no possibility for change really, like the future is just written into what's happening now. And yeah, like do you have any insights about the link between that and the kind of determinism of psychiatry, and like, you know, this idea that, like you mentioned earlier, Vesper, like for example, if you get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that's just it, and it's like, okay, you just take these meds for the rest of your life now. Yeah, and there's like this sense that you're just going to get worse and there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah, I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts about those links and like, yeah, what we can do to disrupt that, or yeah, anything related.
I think there's a quote on capitalism having the power of the divine kings, right? And that you know, just like the divine kings, you know, capitalism can be toppled. And there was a prominent anti-psychiatrist activist named Bonnie Burstow who utilized that quote, had a similar quote, and said that psychiatry has that divine king-like power. You can go up to any individual as a psychiatrist. It doesn't matter if you're a politician, a police officer, how you exist in this society, and you can be deemed mentally ill and incarcerated. And I would say in the when we talk about the determinism of psychiatry and this interlinking and being labeled with a lifelong illness, that it's so important that we really speak to the fact that psychiatry isn't regulated in the way that other institutions are, and that often when we talk about that power to be able to put anyone away and to decide those, that it's not in the hands of public interest, and the fact that we are labeled with these diagnoses that predominantly come from the environmental factors of things such as neoliberalism and how we exist in our society, that it's, you know, and then it then comes back onto us, and we're expected to recover and work through these things. It's a monstrous process. It's the commercialization of emotional distress. And again, I don't know if that answers the question, the kind of the interlinking, but that's you know, that's kind of how I see it. I see it as like psychiatry is used as a supposed biomedical tool for social control in a lot of respects.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And then I think coming from a sort of social, what the only thing I could add from a social theory perspective would be that there's this traditional sort of dichotomy between liberalism or capitalism capitalism and then sort of Marxism perhaps, and both of these are sort of determinist teleological points of view which are sort of imperialist perspectives. You know, if you think of the Cold War, you had the Western world which saw itself as the most developed world, we had the Soviet world, and there were these two alternative paths for development, but you had to go on one path. You know, you had to go on the American path for development or the Soviet path for development. And in many ways, they're both very similar. You know, they both see temporality and time as a linear process that goes from the primitive indigenous people to the kind of civilized, you know, nuclear equipped, space age made sort of billionaires that jet off into space. And like, where else have we got? I mean, that's where we are. And it's a spatial and temporal theory. It's like an ontology for the idea that everything has to be big, everything has to be massive, everything has to be loads of money, everything has to be like fast, everything has to be more progressed and go into space. And like, what I believe anarchists have an alternative, which is that we very much start from ourselves and the autonomy of the self, and validating yourself outside of that. So outside of that space race and that sort of and as Anne said earlier, that kind of like pro-work, you know, view, there's like anti-work. And, you know, how do I validate myself and the way in which I am and I enjoy the world beyond what I produce today or tomorrow or whenever? And you know, to me it's about recomposing community, but only community which validates me, and sort of recomposing my bonds with the environment which I'm completely alienated from, and realizing that that's the most difficult challenge that anyone ever faced, because like that's been taken away from me so far and so long. Like, how do I recompose my community when I don't have one? How do I build a spirituality or a relationship with the environment when I don't have one, you know? And like that's tiny, and it needs to be tiny. So the idea of determinism has to operate within a certain spatiotemporal scale, and the idea of like moving away from that is a very different scale. It's got to be really tiny, and it's got to start with something really tiny within me, I suppose.
I'd just like to say something. Just a point in the chat about MPs can't be sectioned. Yes, they can. There's a whole section in the Mental Health Care and Treatment Scotland Act and in the Mental Health Act that covers England and Wales about how to section an MP. And if they're sectioned for 6 months, they lose their seat. Anyway, that's by the by. About predeterminism, I think you've just got to find the bits of hope. Things do change, things sometimes for the better, sometimes for the good, often in ways we can't anticipate now. We've got to kind of create the space in our own heads and in conjunction with other people to kind of find those spaces where things can move on and change, and just be prepared for stuff. So that's all I got to say. My brain's tired.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that takes us up to finish. I'll just check. Oh, Tom wants to say something.
Yeah, just briefly. So Rihanna mentioned Kropotkin, and he was influenced by the guy that I study, a writer called Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who was writing about the commune, very influential in studying, you know, the Russian commune, and saying that, you know, we shouldn't just destroy the commune because it's not sort of capitalist. There was this view that capitalist agriculture is better than the commune, so therefore we must have capitalist agriculture in Russia. And Chernyshevsky was saying, well, you know, let's think about that first. And so when you were talking about, you know, there was the Soviet Union and that was Marxism, you know, that wasn't Marxism at all. Marxism was completely different. And Marx specifically learned Russian to be able to read Chernyshevsky in Russian. And people like Kropotkin, when he was in London, you know, would have discussions with people like Engels, people like William Morris, and we're discussing Chernyshevsky in this other vernacular tradition of socialism. and it was a vernacular, it was a dialogic tradition of socialism. And, you know, Marxism and socialism has a much richer tradition than Stalinism, than communism. And there was always much more like interconnection between anarchism and Marxism. But obviously this isn't the Marxism that gets taught in, you know, schools or in the, you know, the media and so on. But just about agency and determinism, let me come back to what Rhiannon said about Spinoza and Deleuze. If you look at Spinoza, he's very interested in determinism, but that doesn't mean he denies completely agency. He says a lot of what we do is determined by our social environment. That's exactly what we've been talking about today. If you don't have housing, if you don't have a job, if you're treated like shit, you know, these are, you know, there are causes why people have these problems. So obviously, you know, determinism exists. But then Spinoza was looking at, well, what can we do? That's exactly the discussion today in terms of, you know, what can we do? And what I wanted to say was, actually, if you look at the question of agency, it's also quite similar to what the guys were saying about inclusivity. So on the one hand,
Tom, sorry, I'm just sorry for stopping you there, but like we're already like 4 minutes over the event, and I think like we're trying to wrap it up. Like those are like all good points, but I think we're just all very tired, and it's been a very long day and a lot of organizing. So
yeah,
I'm very sorry to just kind of stop
that's
you
fine.
there.
Thank you for the discussion. I appreciate that.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much to everyone. Yeah, and thank you, Anna, for all of your help as well, and all of the speakers. It's been such an interesting discussion. I'm really glad that we made it happen.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Also on behalf of the Centre for Engaged Philosophy.
Thanks for inviting me. And like, if anyone wants to email me and discuss any of this further, you're very welcome. Like Tom, I was really interested in what he was saying, but yeah, I'm really tired now as well, so I understand why you've cut it off. But if anyone wants to get in touch with me, they're very welcome. And especially the two other speakers, I was so interested in what you were both saying. And often I feel like when people set up a talk, it's so that everyone can argue with each other, but I feel like this time everyone was on the same page. So cheers.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Rhiannon said. It was just brilliant hearing both you and Vesper and what you have to say. I've learned so much, and it was really good to hear the contributions both in the chat and the questions asked verbally. So thank you very much. It's been just a really good night. Thank you.
Yes,
If anybody wants to get in touch with me, no problem. I really welcome that. And I can't remember our email, but I'll say, you know, Zab has it, so she can pass it out with the notes. And yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, everyone. It was great. Thank you, Saab. Thank you, Rhiannon. Thank you, Anne, and everyone who came to Engage and the Center for Engaged Philosophy. You can add me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I will share my email as well. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll end it there, and we'll put the recording and stuff on the website.
So the email address, Anne's email address, is in the chat for the last people standing. Yeah, again, thanks so much. I'm going to leave the event open for another couple of minutes if people want to get information out of the chat. But yeah, everybody, just thanks so much again. Sabina, do you think I can finish the meeting now? You can just nod, I can see you. Or shake your head if you don't want me to stop it. Or maybe you can't hear me actually.
Oh, sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, sorry, I was just asking if you thought I could shut the meeting
Oh,
down
yeah,
now. But yeah, I
yeah.
think most people have left now, so I'm just gonna end the meeting.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, thanks so much. Like, it was so cool. Like, this was like great and very successful. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording now actually.
Oh, yeah.